Hi, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to our webinar broadcast today. This is our final webinar of our series, and today we'll be spending the next 45 minutes or so talking about grazing in riparian areas, looking at some options, as well as some landowners who have implemented different strategies. So in the background here helping me out, I have Kelsey Spicer-Raw, and she's based out of Airdrie, and she's a riparian specialist, and myself, who's doing the presenting of the information. I'm Christy Stebanuk, also a riparian specialist based out of the Lethbridge office. So if you're not familiar with the GoTo software, it allows you to participate in a few ways. So there's live polls, which we'll be doing a few throughout. And then in the question box of your panel there, you can type in questions which we can see come in throughout the webinar, but we'll respond to most of those at the end. And then you can also raise your hand with the little hand icon. So if you can go ahead and do that now to make sure that you can hear me. Okay, so I think everything is okay. And then also in the question box, if you can just type in where you are participating from today. We'll just give you a few seconds there. I think we're getting some answers coming in. All right, thank you everyone. So some of you know cows and fish quite well, but for those that don't, we are the Alberta Riparian Habitat Management Society, better known as Cows and Fish, a nonprofit organization and registered charity operating in Alberta, Canada. And myself and our 15 other staff strive to foster a better understanding of riparian areas for the benefit of those who use and value them, including agriculture producers, which the name Cows and Fish might suggest, and others like those in urban, rural, acreage, cottage, and lakeshore settings and their surrounding communities. So our approach is voluntary in nature and stems from the 3 pillars of environmental stewardship: building awareness, development of an ethic, and the resulting action. So to learn more about how and who we work with, I invite you to visit our website, cowsandfish.org, or connect with us on social media, Facebook or Twitter. So we at Cows and Fish have a great mission statement, that being that we are striving to foster a better understanding of how improvements in grazing and other management of riparian areas can enhance landscape health and productivity for the benefit of landowners, agriculture producers, communities, and others who use and value riparian areas. So we have many publications, but the one you see pictured on your screen there is called The Green Zone, Riparian Areas and Grazing Management. And some of the material from today you can find in that document, which is available on our website in PDF format, or you can also place an order and we can mail that out to you. You'll also find, like I said, a lot of other fact sheets there, so I encourage you to go and check that out. So this brings me to our first poll, which I'll turn over to Kelsey to launch.
Hi, everyone. So our first poll today is asking you, how would you rate your knowledge of grazing in riparian areas prior to this webinar? We'll leave the polls open for about 30 seconds, so if you can grab your mouse and click an answer, that would be great. Hey, great. Lots of participation. That's awesome. Thanks, guys. So the results, we have about 20% of you saying 4, lots of you moderate, good, and a few of you, or maybe just one of you, not sure, 4% showing excellence, which is great. Back to Christy.
Good. Thanks, Kelsey. So Alberta ranching hasn't changed a lot over the years, and in some cases we've been doing things the same way for decades, but there's been little reason to change. And grazing is one of the disturbances on our landscape that we've evolved with. So there's countless numbers of grazing animals, including bison, were present on the North American continent prior to the arrival of Europeans. Accounts by early explorers and fur traders alluded to high populations of bison and poor range condition in some locations. And records from the Hudson Bay Fur Company described overgrazing by bison in Western Canada to the point that little forage existed for their horses. And while these accounts are most likely true, bison often left an area and seldom returned for several years, which gave the range enough time to rest and recover. So it was that migration on the landscape that ensured that grazing pressure was not constant. After grazing, there was always rest. So bison spent the spring and summers in the open prairie and moved to the parkland and foothills in the fall and winter. As the agriculture potential for Alberta was realized in the late 1890s and early 1900s, ranching came first. Ranching at that time followed a similar pattern to the early grazing of bison: big space, no fences, and room to move. Europeans were among the first to settle in the province, and the grazing system changed from an open, climatically driven cycle to a system where humans' grazing pressures were settled and static on the landscape. Homes and ranch operations were established quite closely to water since they relied quite heavily on it. And livestock became fenced into areas, and grazing pressures no longer followed that migratory pattern like the bison. These early operators often didn't have a good understanding of sustainable range management, and overgrazing by cattle was often the end result. So because of situations like the water contamination issues in Walkerton, Ontario, that occurred almost 20 years ago, where water became contaminated by E. coli due to farm runoff, and another situation in North Battleford, Saskatchewan, where it wasn't quite so clear of the cause, and then just the general overall awareness about water quality issues and our high density of livestock in Alberta, people are asking if grazing in riparian areas can happen and still have them perform their key functions and provide the benefits. So the quick answer to that is that it depends. So we live in a land where precipitation varies greatly around an annual average. And unfortunately, we can't count on that average every year. And we can't change how much rain or snow falls, but we can influence how much stays to fuel plant growth, to water livestock and wildlife, and to provide flow in streams and water levels in lakes and wetlands. So how much they store and how quickly the underground reserves empty are affected by how we manage riparian areas. And for those that tuned in to our earlier webinars this week, you will be familiar with the key functions of riparian areas. But for those that have missed it, they're a suite of ecological services that riparian areas can offer when in good functioning condition. So they trap and store sediment, they build banks and shores, store water and energy, recharge aquifers, filter and buffer water, reduce energy, maintain biodiversity, and probably most importantly for today's purposes, they create primary productivity. So all things that the environment can do for us free of charge, but we need to manage that area properly. So before we begin to talk about management, one of the first steps on the land is to distinguish riparian areas from uplands. And sometimes this can be easy, as seen on the photo on the left. That lush green area in the valley bottom is definitely riparian. And sometimes it can be hard, as seen on the photo in the right. It's hard to distinguish where that riparian area ends and the upland begins. And the width of the riparian area will be different depending on your location. However, the distinguishing factors between riparian areas and uplands are higher soil moisture in those riparian areas due to that elevated water table. So that's why these two areas need to be managed differently, because they don't respond to grazing pressures in the same way. So healthy riparian areas are critical for the many benefits that we receive from them, including clean water, fish and wildlife habitat, biodiversity for plants and animals, and forage, which makes riparian areas magnets for livestock and wildlife, as they provide that shelter, water, and that green succulent vegetation. And even during dry periods, the difference between upland forage and riparian vegetation is quite significant. So I'll turn it over to Kelsey for another poll.
Okay, so the second poll is asking, how would you rate your knowledge of the 4 principles of range management? Again, 4, moderate, good, or excellent. So your choice. So grab your mouse and select an answer, and then we'll carry on. Great, you guys are super at responses. So here we go, here's the results. So most of you fall into moderate, with the next highest at 4, somewhat good and somewhat excellent. So hopefully as we continue on, we can help improve that knowledge.
Great, thanks Kelsey. So healthy riparian areas can be a foundation of livestock operations. The potential diversity of plants makes them unique for grazing opportunities if they're managed well. There are many strategies when it comes to grazing management, but the successful ones are going to be compatible with healthy riparian areas. And it has to begin with the understanding of the principles of range management and applying those principles to build and maintain the riparian foundation. So good grazing management practices will imitate that natural system and promote healthy native plant communities in both the uplands and in riparian areas. So those 4 key principles are balancing animal demand with available forage supply, distributing livestock evenly over the landscape, avoiding and minimizing grazing during sensitive times, and providing effective rest after grazing. So maybe an easier way to understand, or remember those 4 principles is with the acronym DIRT. And it's not something you want to see on the ground because that would be poor management. But the acronym is distribution, intensity, rest, and timing. So the first principle is balancing animal demand with available forage supply. And it's important to leave enough litter or carryover to protect the roots of plants and to protect the soil from erosion, to conserve moisture, and provide emergency forage. So balancing animal demand with available forage supply is the concept of knowing what the land will produce for available forage after accounting for carryover, natural processes, species composition, and health, and then adjusting the number of animals and the length of time to achieve that balance. So each pasture has a maximum stocking rate that is possible to maintain year after year without causing damage to the vegetation or related resources. And this is referred to as the carrying capacity. And although stocking rates may vary considerably between years due to fluctuating forage conditions, Carrying capacity is generally considered to be the average number of animals that a particular range will sustain over time and maintain or improve that plant community. So the picture on your screen there shows a pretty good lush area. And then what can happen if that balance is not met between animal demand and available forage supply. But it's not all doom and gloom. As this picture shows, this is a riparian area after grazing, and there's lots of litter that's been left over. So one way to determine if stocking rates are set at appropriate levels for a site is to evaluate the amount of carryover, or that litter, and that comes in the form of material that is left behind to continue some of those key ecological processes that are critical for a healthy pasture. So in the uplands, that litter is important for holding moisture in the soil and keeping that soil in place. And then in riparian areas, that litter is considered a trapping mechanism. So this slide shows some sediment that's been trapped by that vegetation after a spring flood. And many of our valley bottoms and wetland fringes are so productive because that sediment is trapped on the land after those high water events. And this not only provides nutrients to the soil, but it also removes potential water pollutants like phosphorus and nitrogen that are bound to those sediment particles, removes them from that water column. So the vegetation also slows down water and allows it to soak into the ground, recharging groundwater reserves, and then utilized by those plant roots. So this is a landowner we've worked with over the years, Roy Coppathorne, and hiding in the back there's Bill. And they're fixing a pump after high water in June. You can see some debris hung up there. And he pumps water to irrigate adjacent uplands. And Roy says that his biggest challenge is water. Either he has too much, which causes erosion along the banks, or not enough to irrigate those tame pastures that he uses in rotation. Roy also only uses point access, so he doesn't allow cattle to have full access to the stream banks. So pictured here is quite a lot of sediment that has been trapped, helping to build the bank. Roy's owned this property since 2005, and recovery has been relatively slow, but his change in grazing management has been noticeable. During the growing season, he gets asked quite a lot by his neighbors why he's leaving so much grass behind. And his management philosophy is a rough take half, leave half. And Roy is more than happy to show his neighbors the difference in grass production and soil moisture. So the second principle is to distribute livestock evenly. Due to the selective grazing habits of livestock, and localized overgrazing can occur if proper stocking rates aren't used. And distribution can be achieved by using various management tools to spread that grazing pressure over the landscape. This is where the producer is typically the expert, because they'll know whether their animals will respond to salt placement or fencing, water development, or herding. So distribution tools are often part of almost every successful riparian management strategy, and normally they are best used with other tools, and they can be anything that gives you more control over where and when animals will graze and promote the 3 R's, so rest, rotation, and recovery. However, the best distribution tools will not compensate for that overstocking of a pasture. So salt is one of the easiest distribution tools to use, and it's most effective when it's placed away from the stream bank or lakeshore in the uplands. But you're going to want to change that location in the uplands as well, so you don't create those hot spots. And another option to move cattle away from the riparian area is off-stream water. And given a choice, livestock usually drink 8 times out of 10 from a trough, even if they have direct access to surface water. And they would often walk further to drink out of this trough. Sometimes this has to do with the difficulty of access to some surface water if they have to wade through a lot of mud or navigate down a steep stream bank. It's also related to animal security and comfort, so the ability for them to see their surrounding area while they're drinking. But whatever the reason is, off-stream water works to move cattle away from the riparian area. And when we livestock drink out of troughs, the research indicates that they spend they spend more time grazing and ingest more forage, which leads to greater weight gain. And raised troughs like this usually reduces the defecation in the water, so herd health is generally better as well. And what some producers are doing is putting clean rig mats around those troughs to improve some footing and reduce some of that muck as well. So we'll look at a few producers who have put to use some various distribution tools on their operations. So this is Don Ruzicka, and he's encompassed all elements of the 4 principles of grazing management into their day-to-day operations, including distribution tools. And Don says he uses nature as a barometer of what is and isn't working on his farm. So he's incorporated many changes, including solar offsite water. He grazes riparian areas in the fall when they're less susceptible to damage from livestock. And then he custom grazes livestock, which enables him to not have to wait for the right market price before he can sell stock when those pastures really need that rest. So Don uses his farmer know-how and energy from the sun to improve distribution of livestock. And Don tells another story about a producer in his watershed, a rancher in his 80s named Albert, who has always wintered his cows along the creek. So he would go down and chop a hole in the ice so the cows could access the water. But after gaining some awareness about his creek through a local watershed group and a riparian health assessment, Albert now brings a shovel when he goes to chop that hole to pick up the manure and move it off the ice. So it's just those little things that you can do to make improvements. And the neat thing about stewardship is that it's sometimes like a gift, something that you can pass on to your neighbor. And although Don Ruzicka and Mike and Debbie Callan are along 2 different creeks, Don has managed to pass along some of his awareness to Mike over the years about his creek. Mike and Debbie have a small ranching operation with about 3/4 of a mile of creek. They both have off-farm jobs, but they've found time to invest in stewardship. Again, investing in that off-site water to provide cleaner water for their livestock and get better distribution. The Kellans have also built some new fences to restrict access to the creek in some locations where they wanted to see quick recovery and to add rest into their grazing system in other locations by dividing up pastures. So this is the Callans in 2006. Their site was healthy with problems, and they used corridor fencing to get some recovery along those banks. And one thing I'd just like to point out, aside from a ranger or riparian health assessment, that photos are a great tool when monitoring changes over time. So like I said, their site was healthy with problems. So even after 2 years of rest, you can see some of the grass growth there. Temporary fencing is another valuable distribution tool. With a little cost, you can test out how new cross fence might fit into your operation, or the best location where that fence might be. And some found that temporary fencing works so well that they never do put in a permanent fence. So typically temporary fencing is a portable electric system, and there's been a big shift from a battery operated system to a solar powered energizer, and there's quite neat units out there that make electric fencing quite easy. So the third principle is to avoid or minimize grazing during sensitive times. And in riparian areas, there are two main times to watch. One is during the spring when the water table is high after all that snowmelt and spring rain, leaving the stream banks and shores saturated and soft and at risk to trampling and compaction. And you also want to minimize the potential negative effects of spring grazing as this initial growth and energy storage in plants is critical. So grazing very early will use up those stored carbohydrates before the plant can put up enough leaves to start building new energy reserves. And the other time is in late fall when trees and shrubs are susceptible to grazing, particularly when those grasses have become dormant and less palatable and have lower nutritional value. So the key there is to make sure the level of browse is limited by ensuring they have enough grass or other feed so they don't focus too much on those woody plants. And the exact timing of these sensitive periods changes over the years between climate variations. And livestock producers will benefit from adaptive management that incorporates the flexibility of timing of use. So in order to include riparian areas in a rotational grazing system, a riparian pasture should be considered. And that's simply just defining the fencing between uplands separately from those riparian areas. So fencing like with like. And another example would be to fence your tame pasture separately from your native grass so that you can manage those differently. And then keeping in mind those vulnerable periods for riparian areas. So an example of someone who's used a riparian pasture is Lyle on Amos Creek near Tofield, Alberta. And he uses it to maintain a healthy creek and high forage productivity. So this is his place. He's fenced off the creek separately from the upland, the crop, and the tame forage. He used less fence by creating a riparian pasture than he would have if he followed all those bends in the creek. And also something else that Lyle's done is installed multiple gates that he can use for different entry and exit points to alter the distribution from year to year. So this was just a shot taken on the bank of Lyle's Creek, and you can see that woody vegetation, the native grasses and sedges are indicating that the riparian area is healthy. And this is another example of a riparian pasture on the Van der Valk Ranch, west of Claresholm. They've used the riparian pasture for over 40 years, and grazing usually involves about 50 heifers using it for 1 month between mid-March and mid-April, and then 140 yearlings for 1 week between mid-April and the beginning of May. And then usually those yearlings return in July to graze some of the regrowth. So the area is doing well since they're providing adequate rest. So that photo up on your screen was taken in about 1998 and then taken again in 2012. And so they avoid that dormant season use because they know that it harms the woody species that stabilize the stream banks. So this photo was just taken along the bank in 2002. And then in 2012, you can see there was actually a significant increase in those woody species. So they're doing things right there. So the fourth principle is to provide effective rest after grazing. And it's important to give those plants rest when conditions are right to allow them to build roots and restore their energy supply. So here, effective rest is key, which means that it has to happen during the growing season. And rest not only allows the tops to grow, but those roots as well. And as this classic slide shows, the 4 plants represent from left to right, never grazed, once grazed, several times grazed, and grazed every 2 weeks. And you can see the response of both the roots and the upper portion of the plants. So this was done in the early 60s to demonstrate the effect that grazing, or in this case clipping, has on both the above ground portion of the plant and the roots as well. So it mimics that no grazing versus severe. And you can see how the plants respond. The roots become depleted and can't boost the growth above ground. And most often the end result is lost productivity, and pastures can become very vulnerable to drought conditions. So for riparian grazing strategies, it's especially important to keep those roots in the ground to hold the banks together to prevent erosion, so situations like this don't happen. So you can see a lot of slumping of that bank and the potential for a lot of land to be lost. So you want to keep those roots in the ground. So like all grazing, like all renewable resources, it is the foundation of the resource, in this case, the soil, water, and the nutrients, that will determine how productive it is. So maintaining the health of the plants and the soil will allow maximum forage to be produced. If you invest in the capital, you can live off the interest. And there's much wisdom to that old stockman saying, if you keep down the shoot, you'll kill the root. So to achieve effective rest, rotational grazing is an option. And as long as you have 2 pastures, some type of rotation can be achieved. And it just involves that planned sequence of grazing and rest over a number of pastures. So generally, it requires dividing up larger pastures into smaller units, but it can also work in existing pastures using herding practices. And many of the producers we work with use a rotational grazing system. And the more pastures you have, the more rest you can incorporate and allows more flexibility. But that comes with more management, sometimes more fencing, and then potentially more water development, because you're going to need that in every pasture. So this air photo just shows a sequence of use, and that one pasture is being rested. So this is a comparison of what a short time can achieve with a little bit of rest and offsite watering. As you can see, that bank is quite altered and bare in 2005. And then with less cattle hanging out in the riparian area, there's lots of good riparian vegetation recovery after just 2 years. So someone who's used the tools successfully. And then corridor fencing can also be used to achieve rest in a pasture. This is Iron Creek, and they wanted a quick recovery along the bank. So you can see in just 5 years, the amount of vegetation that's filled in has been good. And a mountain view example where exclusion or corridor fence was used. So they followed quite closely along the stream bank there. But they wanted to see quick recovery on their stream banks. So you can see the initial photo and then the recovery after a short period of time. There's lots of lush vegetation along the banks. And this is another example of a rancher in the southwest on Todd Creek. and this was from the mid-80s. The Ferrises wanted to protect the riparian area because they winter grazed their cattle in the adjacent pastures. So they created a corridor fence, and there's a gentleman standing there who's over 6 feet tall, and as you can see, the grass is as tall as he is. So the accumulation of all that litter is hindering the normal growth of the other vegetation species and creating quite heavy competition for trees and shrubs to establish, and it's also posing a fire hazard. So looking back, the Ferrises realized that they would have done things differently. They would have created a larger area and not fence so close to the creek so that they could graze in there to get rid of some of that litter. But it takes these learnings to realize what works and what doesn't. But there are some concerns when it comes to riparian corridor fencing. This is Dog Pound Creek during a flood. And corridor or exclusion fencing is generally done close to the water's edge. So it usually bisects riparian habitat, which can limit the use by wildlife and livestock because such a narrow corridor is fenced off, so hard to get those cattle to graze there. And corridor fencing can lead to increased building costs by following all those bends so closely. Generally increases the length of your fence, and then maintenance costs can go up as well from damage due to ice, jams, or flooding. So usually a better option is to create a riparian pasture as seen here on Pipestone Creek, which shows not only a healthy functioning riparian area, but also a good buffer that's large enough to be grazed. So grazing management isn't just about maintaining a healthy riparian area, but is about maintaining the health of all pastures within a land holding. So if things are in balance, we can obtain pastures that are an expression of what they should be successionally and be in good condition. And if the 4 principles are out of balance, that successional spring is forced downward, and we can get pastures that look like this, where the vegetation is overgrazed and held back from its optimum state. But when things are in balance, the succession spring is released and plant communities are able to thrive. So you can have that balance. And key considerations for riparian grazing strategies. These are things that you should try and build into your management practices, is maintaining the right vegetation species, so plants that are deep-rooted like willows and dogwood, or plants that grow in mats like sedges are great. And then it's also good to have species diversity or layering of vegetation types, and that not only provides wildlife habitat, but shelter for livestock as well. And then just maintaining adequate cover to dissipate stream energy, trap sediment, and prevent erosion, and avoiding grazing during those sensitive times. So long continuous grazing systems usually leads to reduced riparian and range health, and that's simply because they go against all 4 grazing principles. They usually allow cattle to graze where and when they choose, and higher stocking rates can generally lead to a greater risk. So we need to manage where and when cattle graze to prevent them spending too much time in these valuable areas. So things to avoid are placing new water development right next to the stream channel or in the drainage area. And although water development is good, placement of that system is key. So you're trying to minimize the impacts of cattle trampling along those moist banks and soft soils. So a better location here would have been in the uplands, and that would get better distribution as well. And as mentioned, salt placement and mineral is another thing to avoid right next to the creek or lake shore. They don't take salt and mineral at the same time as water, so they can find that in the uplands, which draws them away from the riparian area. And it's one of the easiest things and doesn't cost anything to move that. Supplemental feeding right by the river or lake should also be avoided. This can lead to increased localized pressure on the vegetation and soil, which decreases the performance of those riparian functions, like trapping sediment and nutrient filtration. So because the livestock will be concentrated there, there's going to be more nutrients to filter out. So here a better option would have been in the trees, and that would have provided also better shelter for the livestock as well. So our third poll, I'll turn it over to Kelsey.
Hi again. So the third poll is just asking, it's pretty straightforward, do you manage livestock on land you own, rent, or lease? Just yes or no. So grab your mouse, we'll leave this open for another 15 seconds or so. Okay, so we're still collecting a couple of responses. I'm gonna close it. And let's see. So yes, the majority are no. So I'm guessing, and based on the registration list, we have a lot of folks like ourselves, like Christy and I, that work with producers to manage cattle. But we do have some producers on as well. So welcome, and we'll continue on.
Thank you, Kelsey. So how riparian areas respond to grazing depends on a few factors, and not all riparian areas are going to respond the same. Some of these sustainable strategies are not all about those intense fencing projects or, big projects that cost a lot. They can just be small adjustments that don't require much, if any, extra effort. And so about half of the riparian areas that Cows and Fish has inventoried have had grazing, and typically riparian health has fallen into the healthy but with problems category. So that means there is room for improvement, but most of those riparian functions are still being performed. So riparian areas will respond to management strategies depending on the type of plant communities that are growing there, the current condition of range and riparian health to start with, the intensity and frequency of use, and then the strategies to achieve those principles will differ. So we encourage producers to develop a plan that combines all the factors that suits the grazing resources, sustains those resources, and then helps meet their operation goals. So developing a management plan can include range health assessment, and this tool is available on the government website as well as some plant community guides for different natural regions. So I encourage you to look at that. And then we have a riparian health assessment booklet for streams and small rivers, as well as a separate booklet for lakes, sloughs, and wetlands. Those tools are available on our website. And we also offer field days for staff that help producers as well as producers to learn how to use these tools so they can implement them on their own operations. And then we encourage producers to assess the risks and opportunities, so other land uses they might be facing on their operations. And then we encourage producers to map out their fence lines, where their gates are, if there's any other water development that they've done. And that just gives you a sense of, you know, where things can be changed if they need to be. And then just assessing your resource management and livestock management goals and your resource integration issues, if any adjustments need to be made. So it's about creating an action plan and then a monitoring strategy to record where and how many animals that are grazed in a pasture. So keeping those good notes is key for changing things year after year. So that's a good way to set things up. So to reiterate those 4 key principles, remember to practice implementing the acronym DIRT, distribution, intensity, rest, and timing, and not producing that dirt on the ground. So management tools are really just a giant toolbox, and searching for the right tool might take some time, some tinkering, some trial, and some error. But in the end, there's usually so many choices that there's likely one that'll work. And it's the choices that producers make on the ground on how they manage that will really determine how their land will look, as this fence line contrast shows. On the right has not been grazed, and on the left you can see the impacts that grazing has left. So it's all about balance, and I'll end with Perry's philosophy, and that's, if I'm not managing for a balance between the environment and production, I'm heading for a disaster in both. So without our members and supporters, our work wouldn't be possible. So a huge thank you to them. Our contact information is available on our website, and although Kelsey and I are based in 2 different offices, there are others throughout the province. So if you're looking for somebody specific in your area, you can check that out. And I think we have one more poll left.
Okay, before we do questions, we'll just do the last poll, and you'll see when you get the evaluation after in your emails that the first and the last poll question will be repeated. So if you can remember your answers, that would be great. We're just tracking it a couple different ways. So this one again is, how would you rate your knowledge of riparian grazing management after this webinar? For moderate, good, excellent. And I think for myself that even I learned something today. I hadn't heard the DIRT acronym before, so that one's going to stick with me. So we'll close this off, and let's see. So it looks like we jumped a little bit from in the moderate and good, and a few more in the excellent category. So that's great. Thanks for your participation in those goals. So now we do have some time for questions. I can read off. Christy and I are in 2 different offices today, but I can read off a couple of the questions that I've seen here. So there was one question about the riparian pasture at Vanderbilt. And the question is that we mentioned they graze in early March and April, and would this not be still in dormant season? Yes, that would likely be still in dormant season and not part of the province. Are they feeding as well? I don't know the answer to that, but how do they balance woody use and sensitive wet spring soils? And that's a good question. The one thing I think that adds the success of this riparian pasture that I know, and it's not one that I'm super familiar. So Christy, after I'm done, you can add in if you know more. But I think one of the keys to success is the amount of rest that is provided for recovery during the growing season. And I know that the Vanderbilts are also very careful to watch for any cues for overuse of their woody plants. So those willows and things that they know are important for stream bank stabilization, and know they're also important for providing shelter. And I think that they also are pretty flexible, that depending on the year, they may adjust some of that early dormant season grazing, sort of that early spring grazing, maybe move it to the uplands if they're noticing that those woody plants are getting hit a lot more. That was one question. Christy, did you have anything to add to that one?
Nope, that's yeah, the flexibility and just keeping an eye on those species is really all they do. Those dates are you know, something that they provided us, but obviously that's that can be changed.
The next one is where's the grazing notebook available and what does it include? So those little grazing notebooks used to be from public lands, and to tell you the truth, I'm not sure if they're still available or not. I know we have a few folks on from public lands on the line, so if you know if those little grazing notebooks are available, you could just type that into the question box and let us know. What barriers are commonly cited by ranchers? So I'm guessing this is asking about barriers to making a change in their grazing plan or in their grazing management. And it depends on the community, I find, and in what part of the province you're working in, and on the state of agriculture kind of at the time. But quite often, you know, the first and the easy ones to rattle off are time and money. Sometimes people suggest that you know, it's not necessarily those, but it's more that, you know, the ranching population is aging, and you know, they sometimes they've done it so long in one way, they may not feel, you know, they have the time to change or the energy to change. I've heard people say as well, you know, they've had trouble finding hired help and finding sustained hired help. So, you know, they're getting the basics done on the ranch, but they're not getting anything over and above that done. Christy, anything else that you've heard from sort of barriers to making management changes?
No, sometimes it's just you know, they're not sure where they should start. So just coming out and having a look with them and talking about, you know, what they want to achieve. They've found that that's beneficial as well, just having that conversation.
Yeah, so awareness is a good one. And sometimes it's also about help that they can find too, in terms of, you know, technical assistance. You know, if there's someone at the county that's really keen and really helpful, sometimes that leads to a lot of different management change. Or if they know someone at an NGO or someone actively working in the area, that helps with change. Definitely, some of the cows and fish evaluation work has shown that, you know, change doesn't happen quickly. It generally takes multiple interactions and over multiple years for change to occur. How about, let me just go down. Someone asked about leaving pasture in the spring to protect the ducklings, finding the water they need, so wildlife and grazing management. And lots of producers are familiar with timing, especially when it comes to haying and around wetlands and things, that they'll delay their haying practices until after July 15th. But it depends on I guess, the type of riparian area and what type of habitat is there.
I see a question about what strategies are in place to manage the cattle in Kananaskis country. So I know that public lands are doing some evaluations on their grazing practices, and yeah, there's always rest incorporated, and it's multiple land uses really that's an issue.
Yeah. So there was a couple of questions, actually, two questions about the other question about managing grazing around nesting habitat for birds or migrating species. So those are good questions, and some producers definitely do take those types of things into account. And I don't know, Christy, have you ever met a producer that's, you know, adjusted his grazing plan or timing of grazing based on bird species or migration?
Not that I know of off of hand, but you know, generally the wildlife and the livestock use the same areas, so there's you know, there's balance between the two.
Oh. Any other questions if you're typing them in quickly? If not, we'll get back to you after the webinar as well. That looks like all the questions for now.
Great.
Okay, so I'll let you sign off, Christy.
Okay, thanks everyone for participating. And if you have any questions, you can contact us individually. So again, thanks.